So this week we are talking about the pelvis. We're moving through the pelvis. We are connecting especially with the iliopsoas muscle that moves from the spine down through the pelvic ball all the way to the thigh bone. We think about how we move the thigh bone in the hip sockets, and we think about how we move the pelvis on the thigh bone and how that responds to the rest of the spine. So that's all very structural, but what is so important for us to understand about the pelvis is it's not just a structure, it's not just a tightness in our hips, but how the movement of the pelvis connects to the rest of the body. So we have all our organs being held by the pelvis. So I sometimes talk about how the pelvis, the pelvic ball, this is like a ball, connects to the rib cage. So whether you're seated or standing, or like me standing on the knees, how is the pelvis and the rib cage connected? Because from underneath the ribs, we have the diaphragm, which is the big muscle underneath the lungs. When we exhale, it moves up. When we inhale, it kind of flattens down. What it flattens down into are all our internal organs. So you can imagine, if I'm going to sit down on a block, you can imagine if you are collapsing, not only are you stressing your lumbar spine and putting pressure on the sacrum and sacroiliac joints, but you're also compressing your diaphragm, so you can't breathe properly, you can't actually stretch the diaphragm, the respiratory diaphragm. The organs in here are kind of compressed and moving back. Same thing if you are overarching in the back like this. You are compressing the lumbar spine in a different direction, and again pushing all the organs forward in towards the abdominal wall, so the abdomen here. So you want to find somewhere in between, noting that the lumbar spine curves. So, there's overarching, there's rounding, and there's somewhere in between. And again, we're all different. I know I have more pronounced lumbar spine than a lot of other people do. So I know I have to be mindful of how I move my body from the lumbar spine. But if we think of that connection of the pelvic ball, and there's a connection to the rib cage, and we want everything that's in here having the most space to come into their perfect positioning. We have obviously the diaphragm that has to move. When we inhale, it has to expand, almost pressing down. When we exhale, it draws up again. We have our stomach, we have our liver, we have our large intestine, our small intestines, all of our organs, our kidneys, our bladder further down, all of these organs, if you think of them as being housed in this amazing space in your anatomy, how can you make them happy? How can you create space for them? How can you allow movement, so when you breathe, the abdomen or the abdominal organs get a little bit of a massage? Obviously in yoga practice, sometimes we do deep back bends, sometimes we do deep forward bends and side stretches. So we are almost massaging and creating space and allowing things to move. But notice if you're collapsing in your lower back, either arching or rounding too much. So especially if you're just sitting, watching this video on the floor on a chair, this is where in a daily life, notice if you're collapsing. Can you even breathe? Can you really allow the diaphragm to stretch? If you are overarching, how does the support feel for your organs? And even imagine how all the organs in your abdomen helps to support the spinal column, so the whole of the spine. How does that work? So when we start to move from the pelvis, we can think about how that actually supports our organs, how it supports specifically the diaphragm. And this is just so important at the minute, because we really have to learn to breathe properly, for anxiety, for stress, but for our respiratory health as well. So I don't have all the organs, I don't even have a picture of it here, but you can imagine, you could even just, Google internal organs. But in here you can see this is the pelvis. This is a pelvis with muscles. But just a few bits inside the pelvis, we have our rectum, like that. We have the bladder at the front. For female anatomy, we have the vagina, the uterus, the ovaries, and that's just what's inside the pelvis. Then obviously from the rectum we have the intestines, the stomach, etc., etc. So how our postures will very much affect our digestion, pelvic organs, our breath. So again this week and beyond, notice how is the pelvis moving? How is it connected to your rib cage? How can you breathe?